Today's briefing will discuss the status of Syrian refugees in Turkey, Jordan, and the U.S. We have three phenomenal speakers and experts joining us, and we're thankful that they took time out of their day to be with us here. Before we start with the introductions, just a couple of housekeeping items. Again, as I said, we do hope to have time for question and answer at the end of the session. If we're unable to get to your question, or if there's any more information or material that you want, we can either email you or whatever, so we can reach out to you with the requested information. Today's briefing will discuss the following question. And as we know already, the refugee crisis in Syria, spilling over to Turkey and Jordan is a serious issue and probably the largest refugee crisis we've seen right now in our lifetime. It's something that has had profound impact on politics, policies, and a lot of what we're seeing today. There's millions of refugees across the region, and today's briefing will discuss what can the U.S. do as a major power to assist in the Syrian refugee crisis. How do the policies of Turkey, Jordan, and the U.S. affect the future of Syrian refugees? How are Syrian refugees treated in their host countries? And then mention the panelists will take questions from staffers in the public. I'm going to do quick introductions of our speakers. To my immediate left is Amy Austin Holmes, Associate Professor of Sociology, American University Cairo, Visiting Professor at Harvard University. Amy Holmes finished her PhD at Johns Hopkins University, a former Fulbright scholar in Germany. She was the first person to conduct a survey of the Syrian democratic forces between 2015 and 2019. Her current research focuses on the intersection of continuous politics and security issues, broadly defined. In her first book, Social Unrest and American Military Bases in Turkey and Germany since 1945, was published by Cambridge University. Having spent a decade living in the Middle East through a period known as the Arab Spring, she has published numerous articles on Turkey, Egypt, Turkey, Bahrain, and Kurdish regions in Iraq and Syria. We're thankful that Amy is able to join us. Next to Amy is Professor Sahar Aziz, who's a dear friend of ABC and the community, and a strong advocate on behalf of Arabs and Muslims in the U.S. and across the world. Sahar is a professor of law, Chancellor's social justice scholar, and Middle East and legal studies scholar at Rutgers University Law School. Professor Aziz's work adopts an interdisciplinary approach to examine intersections of national security, race, and civil rights with a focus on the adverse impact of national security policies on minorities in the U.S. She's also a faculty affiliate of the African American Studies Department at Rutgers University and an editor for the Arab Law Code in 2017. She was selected as a recipient of the Research Making an Impact Award by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Thank you, Sahar, for coming down and being with us. And at the end of the table is my colleague and friend and ABC Senior Staff Attorney, Iman Boukadoum. Imam Boukadoum is a human rights lawyer with over 7 years of policy, litigation, and community engagement experience. Her work focuses on intersectional ways in which the war on terror, war on drugs, and immigration laws harm Arabs and other marginalized communities. Her extensive grassroots background recently culminated in the creation of an 18-month interfaith leadership academy that focuses on civic engagement, legal literacy, and community organizing training for marginalized New York communities. Ms. Boukadoum currently works on immigration reform, surveillance, and challenging post-9/11 ultranationalism and racial justice. Thank you for our speakers for being here. Their bios are on the papers in the back. Please do sign in, and I'll kick it over to you guys to start. So, thank you.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to the organizers for putting this panel together. I know that it's a lot of work, and I know there's a lot happening now in Washington, D.C., and in Turkey, Syria, and the wider region, so I'm appreciative that you all took time to come here to our briefing. So, as was just mentioned, I did actually my PhD work in Turkey, so I've been conducting research on Turkey since 2003, and I've done this survey of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which I began in 2015 until 2019. It's a survey that I conducted in all 6 regions of northeast Syria that has been under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces, There's a copy of of my report based on this survey data that was published with the Wilson Center in the back, on the table in the back, as well as a few other publications that I'll reference here. So in case you want more information, just don't hesitate to take a copy of those publications or ask me afterwards. So I'm going to be speaking about Turkey and the issue of the Syrian refugees in Turkey, and then my colleague will speak about Jordan and the United States. So as I'm sure all of you know, Turkey has been hosting 3.6 million Syrian refugees for quite a long time, since the Syrian crisis began. They have been receiving a substantial amount of support from the European Union for hosting those refugees. And according to the Turkish Ministry of Interior, 66% of the refugees that are currently in Turkey, the Syrian refugees that are in Turkey, they fled from regime-held territory. So they were fleeing from Bashar al-Assad, let's say 2/3 of the Syrian refugees in Turkey. Some estimate that actually it's closer to 80% of the Syrian refugees in Turkey that they fled from regime-held territory. Because as I'm sure you know, Syria is, the regime in Damascus currently controls about 60% of the territory of Syria. Some analysts have been saying Assad has won the Syrian conflict. I would say he's won 60% of the territory, 40% of the territory is not under his control. And I think it's just important to point out that the vast majority of refugees in Turkey, either 2/3, over 60% to 80%, they fled from regime-held territory. They fled from Bashar al-Assad or the northwest. Only 17%, 17% fled from the northeast, which currently is under the control of the SDF. As I'm sure you know, the northeast, there was also previously a lot of that territory was held by the Islamic State, and now that that's been liberated from the Islamic State after they declared the territorial caliphate to be defeated on March 23rd, that has been under the control of the SDF. So I'm just pointing this out because Erdogans Plan, which he announced on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly about a month ago, a little over a month ago, was that he publicly stated that he wants to deport millions. He at first said 3 million, now I think he's saying 2 million of the Syrian refugees in Turkey back to Syria. Now, he does not want to have them go back to places where most of them are from. He wants to actually deport them to this strip of land in the north, which predominantly is a Kurdish region. And so he's not suggesting that, for example, Syrians from Raqqa should go back to Raqqa, right? He's basically saying, we'll go back to this region in the north, in the Kurdish, predominantly Kurdish region of northern Syria, and that he will then, put them back there. And he's even asking the West to subsidize this to the tune of $27 billion to reconstruct the area. And so, first of all, the forcefully displacing refugees is illegal. Refoulement is illegal under international law. Secondly, what he's suggesting is, again, not that they go back to their region of origin, but that they go back to the predominantly Kurdish region in the north. And so I see it personally as a kind of forced Arabization policy, because you would be taking predominantly Arab regions from the south of Syria and putting them into the Kurdish region of the north. Those of you who are familiar with Syrian history probably know that the Hafez al-Assad and the regime, the Ba'athist regime, has also engaged in forced Arabization by displacing and forcibly, changing the demographics in Syria in order to break up the Kurdish region in the north. Now, it's also important to point out that because this is now portrayed in the media and it's often talked about as, this is the Turkish sort of narrative that, well, we need to create this buffer zone in order to protect us from the Syrian Democratic Forces, which Turkey sees as identical to, or the YPG as identical to the PKK. However, the Turkish government has actually been demanding a buffer zone since at least 2011. So since before the YPG emerged, since before the SDF was created, since before you had the establishment of this relatively, semi-autonomous region in northern Syria. So if you go back, there's an interview with Abdullah Gül, the former president, where he spoke about this already in 2011. So my assessment is that this is actually not about the fact that Turkey is actually threatened by the SDF and the YPG, but that it's a land grab essentially, and that Turkey is virtually extending their border to the south by some 30 kilometers. They were not able to do that as long as U.S. forces were present in northern Syria. However, in a phone call on October 6th between Erdogan and President Trump agreed to withdraw U.S. forces. He ordered the U.S. to withdraw, and then on October 9th, just a few days later, Turkey launched a military operation known as Peace Spring in Turkey, Operation Peace Spring. On October 11, so 2 days after the operation began, I co-authored an op-ed in the Washington Post, which there's a copy of in the back, where we pointed out that already just within the first few days of that operation, already over 100,000 people were displaced. That was on October 11th. Now we estimate over 200,000 civilians have been displaced. And this is, it's leading to a massive displacement of civilians, not just the YPG or the combatants or the militants, but the civilians are being displaced in the hundreds of thousands. And, Erdogan's plan, as he publicly stated, is then to replace those people who are actually native to that area with the Syrian refugees from Turkey and to put them into this region that is now where civilians have been fleeing, which, is essentially a form of ethnic cleansing. It's massive demographic re-engineering to, first of all, forcibly displace the local population and then replace them with other people who are not from there. I mean, that's the definition of ethnic cleansing. So, and this is what he's publicly said he's going to do. On October 12th, again, just a few days after the operation began, Hevlin Khalaf was assassinated by Ahrar al-Shakia, one of the Turkish-backed rebel groups that has been fighting inside what's now referred to as the Syrian National Army, this umbrella group of various Islamist militias that Turkey is cooperating with. Hevlin Khalaf was the Secretary General of the Syria Future Party. She was a civilian Kurdish politician and engineer. I believe she was 30 years old. She was driving in her car on the M4 highway, and she was assassinated by Ahrar al-Shakia. They posted a video of this online. And this is a war crime. So, in the hearing last week, Ambassador James Jeffrey, who's the special envoy for Syria, said that the U.S. is investigating this war crime. I believe he spoke even in the plural, so war crimes that have been committed by the Turkish-backed rebel groups, including not only Ahrar al-Shakia, but also the Sultan Murad Brigade and others. And another worrying development is that, so on then, just to finish the sort of narrative, because there's a lot that happened. So she was assassinated on October 12. October 17, the U.S. negotiated a ceasefire with Turkey through a false Secretary of State Pompeo and James Jeffrey traveled to Ankara. They negotiated a ceasefire. What was agreed then in Ankara was the establishment of a security zone east of the Euphrates and west of the Tigris. It would extend approximately 5 kilometers deep, between 5 to 14 kilometers deep between Tel Abyad and Sarakani, or Ras Al Ain is the Arab name of the town. Sarakani is the Kurdish name. So this region has essentially been ceded to Turkey, to Turkish control, and that the U.S. and Turkey would conduct joint patrols. The YPG would withdraw from that region. and that the SDF would destroy the fortifications that had built along the border. Now, and regarding the issue of just destroying the fortifications, this is something that the U.S. had actually been discussing with negotiating between Turkey and Ankara for months leading up to the intervention. And the SDF actually not only destroyed their fortifications, their military fortifications, but they even removed things like civilian bomb shelters, because Turkey claimed those were fortifications, and so they even removed these protective bomb shelters for civilians. So, and we had told the SDF, don't worry, remove your fortifications. We're still, going to be here. We'll watch out for you. And then, of course, Trump ordered the withdrawal. And so it's, many people have spoken of it as a betrayal. I would say it's a, not just one betrayal, but multiple betrayals. Because we first actually told them to remove their fortifications and we're protecting them. And also, I think it's important to point out, because it's also talked about, well, it's a betrayal of the Kurds. It is a betrayal of the Kurds. It's also a betrayal of the Arabs in the SDF. It's a betrayal of the Christians in the SDF. It's a betrayal of the small Yazidi minority in the SDF. And there's even a small Turkmen minority in the SDF. So this is one of the findings of my survey, is that, because I was conducting the survey, and one of the pieces that, as a sociologist, one of the important data points is gender, ethnicity, age, region of origin. And so, although the SDF is often talked about as a Kurdish force, and even until now, in fact, the majority of the rank and file fighters, right, not the leadership, the rank and file, the majority are Arabs. Because as the SDF liberated Raqqa and Dinazur and Manbij, Taka, these are probably Arab cities. And so they incorporated Arabs into the SDF. There's also a Christian component of the SDF, known as the Syrian Military Council in the northeast, and they live very close to the Turkish border, like 1 mile, 2 miles from the Turkish border, the Christians in the north. The Assyrian Christian minority. Now, in 2015, the Assyrian community around Tel Tamr, that's an historically Assyrian, it's a Christian minority that was heavily targeted by Daesh, by the Islamic State in 2015. At that time, in 2015, about 220 Assyrians were kidnapped by the Islamic State. At the time, both the State Department and the National Security Council condemned this ISIS attack on the Christian minority around Tel Tamr. And now what is happening is that the Turkish-backed rebels are pushing into that same community, into that exact same region where they were attacked by the Islamic State in 2015. Now, and if you watch any of the videos that they post of themselves, right? I mean, they're not hiding it. They publicly post these videos. Sahar Aziz and Sultan Buhad, they are, Islamist groups that are attacking Christians. They refer to Kurds, although Kurds are probably Muslims, also as heretics, etc. So this is particularly worrying, that this Christian minority, the community, is again being targeted now by the Turkish-backed rebels in 2015 by the Islamic State. And the Ras Al Ain, actually, the city of Ras Al Ain, which is now one of the areas that's under the control of the Turkish-backed groups, that has essentially, this land has been essentially ceded now to Turkey. This is actually one of the sites where the Armenian genocide took place. If you look at a map of the sites where deportation and then the massacres, the atrocities that were committed at the time of the Armenian genocide, Ras Al Ain is one of the cities where this happened. And that is now, again, being subjected to these kinds of atrocities. And personally, I find this grotesque, that the House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning and recognizing the Armenian genocide as a genocide. And at the very same time, we're allowing one of the very same locations where the genocide took place more than 100 years ago for a repeat, essentially, where the Christian minorities are once again being targeted, this time by groups that are backed by Turkey. Now, the Turkish military themselves say they are not 100% in control of these groups, and so that gives them a level of deniability. But one consideration would be that because there are discussions about sanctioning Turkey, as I'm sure all of you know, I think it would make sense that we sanction Ahrar al-Shakia, sanction Sultan Murad, and some of these Turkish-backed groups that are taking part in this operation that have committed war crimes, documented on video, and so that would be, I think, one clear thing that we should do in a response to this. The issue of the exact location of the U.S. military presence has not been decided yet. So now President Trump decided that we will keep some troops around the oil fields. I personally think it's morally bankrupt if we're protecting oil fields and not the actual people who live there, the people who are under threat by these groups. I think that we should reconsider what exactly is our purpose over there. But the issue of the U.S. presence is still being negotiated. Also, the issue of the air cover. So the U.S. has had, air cover. They're responsible for the air cover in northeast Syria. And, this raises the question, if these war crimes are happening essentially because we gave the green light for Turkey to move in, and while we control the air cover, I mean, to what extent could we be held partially accountable, or at least because we can, we see what's happening, and we gave the green light for Turkey to do this operation, and we are also in control of the airspace. So, what responsibility could we potentially have for these crimes that are happening? Now, I would, just as a final remark, I would like to say that, I have tried to warn about this for a long time. I wrote an op-ed in December 2018 when Trump made the first withdrawal announcement, saying that, look, if we withdraw, the local people there, Kurds, Christians, are going to be put in danger. I've made many videos during my trips to Syria, posted them on my Twitter account with a whole range of people there, including Syrian Christians, Kurds, Arabs, Yazidis, Turkmen. So you can actually see yourself in the videos the diversity of this region. And I was invited in at the end of September by the CHP party to talk about U.S. policy towards Syria at a conference in Istanbul. And I presented, with the recommendations of the Syria study group, which had just been published 2 days before that, and I also mentioned my own research and the fact that the SDF is a multi-ethnic force, there's Arabs, Kurds, Christians, etc. And then I was really attacked in the pro-Erdogan AKP media because they thought it was scandalous that I just presented basic demographic information about the fact that there are majority Arabs now with the SDF. I mean, so I think that Turkey and the Turkish government is perhaps, it raises the question, to what extent are they aware of who exactly they're killing? I mean, do they actually know who they're going after? I mean, because they portray them all as Kurds, but the majority are Arabs, actually. So, I've warned them, if you attack Syria, you may be just as likely to kill Arabs or Christians as Kurds in your quest to destroy the PKK. And now that some, Arabs and Christians have been killed and injured in this attack, I posted a photo soon after the operation began of a Christian woman that was injured in the airstrikes in Kamishli. And now that tweet and that photo is banned in Turkey. There was an order, I just found out a few days ago. So, so I think there's a real, denial or a lack of awareness, perhaps, in Turkey about the human costs and who exactly are they targeting in this operation, or they are aware of it, but they don't want any information to come out about it because it undermines their narrative of what they are doing. So, we happy to answer any questions in the Q&A.
Good morning. Thanks so much to the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee for co-sponsoring this with the Center for Security-Based Rights, which I direct at Rutgers Law School based in Newark. And thank you all for coming this early in the morning. I know that there are many other alternatives and options in a town as busy as Washington, D.C. But I think I will interpret your attendance as a commitment to the issues that are confronting Syrian refugees across the world. What I'm going to focus on today is the situation of Syrian refugees, particularly in the region, in the Middle East, where the vast majority of them are, and give you some insights as to what we learned. I took a group of law students in 2018, 2017, excuse me. The winter of 2017, we went down there in Jordan, and we did some field work. We talked to Syrian refugees, we talked to UN officials, we talked to nonprofits, talked to the Jordanian government. We wanted to know what they thought, what their experiences were, rather than relying on pundits and think tanks and policymakers who tend to have overarching agendas as politicized. So we learned quite a bit from these interviews, and then we also did some very thorough research. Before I go into the details, I just wanted to plug in the report. It's called Towards Sustainability and Empowerment, Reforming America's Syrian Refugee Policy. It's available on csrr.rutgers.edu. That's the website for the Center on Security-Based Rights. You can download it there for free. It's very comprehensive, and for the policy wonks in the room, lawyers and law students, you will be delighted, and for others, you may fall asleep to it. But let's just say that we did our homework, so we do know what we're talking about. So let me just give you kind of an overarching perspective for those who may not be familiar. You've got about 13 million Syrian refugees internally and externally. About 5.6 million of them are internally displaced within Syria, so they've been forced to move somewhere else due to safety concerns or persecution. And then you have another 6 to 7 million that are externally displaced. 5.6 million of those externally displaced refugees are in the Middle East. That is the region, and those are the citizens and the people that are bearing the economic and political and social consequences of the refugee crisis. This is the worst refugee crisis in modern history. It's worse than World War II in terms of the numbers. It's devastating. We have been largely shielded from its repercussions. So whenever you hear people talking about it, at least in the US, it's from a very privileged, ossified and rarefied context. And I think if we were in the Middle East, we would have a particular appreciation for what's going on. Apparently, there's some other action. I'll try to speak over them. So of those 5.6 to 6 million in the 5.6 in the region, you've got 3.6 to 4 million in Turkey. It's the largest number. It's an extraordinary number. The population of Turkey is about 80 million. So you're talking here about 5 to 6% of the population is Syrian refugees. 500,000 to 1 million of them are in Istanbul alone. Okay. And you have 3 point.
From there,
So, going back to the overarching picture for Syria, so you have 3.6 to 4 million in Turkey. You have between 700,000 to 1 million in Jordan, which is the country we went to visit to research this. You have 1.3 to 1.5 million in Lebanon. It's a tiny little country that, as you know, already has a history of sectarian violence and a devastating 15-year civil war. And so all of 5.6 million in the region, and yet you hear all of these complaints in Western media about how there's been an invasion of Syrian refugees as part of a broader Islamophobic anti-Muslim narrative, immigrant invasion, Muslim invasions of Europe and the West, and yet there is no more than 1 million across the entire continent of Europe. So you've got about 200,000 in Germany, 116,000 Syrian refugees in Sweden, 59,000 in Canada, and our proud United States of America doesn't even have 20,000 Syrian refugees. So when they teach you in schools that this is the land of refuge for those seeking persecution, fleeing persecution, they're lying. They're lying. You just have to accept that. And then you have to decide if that's the type of country you want, because it's your country. It's your government. And people outside this country hold you responsible, because this is actually a democratic, relatively democratic country, so you can't blame the dictators. 20,000, and Turkey's taking 4 million. How has Turkey treated those refugees? They've given them access to education, so they register them, they give them ID, they're temporary guests, which is a legal term, but it's legally, they are not, there's no deadline for them to leave, notwithstanding what recently happened in terms of Erdogans attempts, but they have access to education, have access to social services, they have work permits, and the vast majority of them, I'm going to estimate around 90% are not in camps. Turkey does not put Syrian refugees in camps. They integrate them, and they're actually trying to spread them throughout the country. So when you see what they've done, it's quite impressive from a humanitarian refugee policy perspective. Now, things are changing, and I'll get into that in a minute. But that gives you some perspective. Then let's look at Jordan, because we use that as a case study. Jordan has an estimated 1 million. Officially, it's 670,000, but I think more realistically, it's 5 million. 80% of them are not in camps. 20% are in camps, and that has its pros and cons. You can't leave, you're stuck there. However, when you're in camp, you do have more access to humanitarian aid, because it's a much more formal process where there's food that's distributed, there's some health services to the extent that they have education for the children, but you're in prison, you're detained, and you can't leave, and you can't work. There are studies showing that there's rises in mental health problems and domestic violence and petty crime because people feel trapped. The other 80% that are out are trying to survive. Now, Jordan, in contrast to Turkey, does not give work permits, very, very limited work permits, to sectors in which the Jordanians don't want to work. So agriculture or some type of vocational work. But generally, also all of these Syrians, and there's millions of them across the world, that are professionals. And they're doctors, and they're engineers, and they're business owners, and they're business professionals, and they're teachers. In places like Jordan, because they don't have a work permit, they cannot work in their field. So many of them end up going to the informal sector, working on the ground. And as we all know, because we also have that issue here, where we, for some reason, do not want to provide work permits for people who may not be documented, and that's going to somehow help our economy. But what it really does is it deflates wages and exposes these individuals to exploitation. They have absolutely no worker protection. And then usually the workers, the native workers, also then suffer from wage deflation because the businesses exploit this shadow economy. They also have very limited access to health care. So over time, Jordan closed its borders around 2016. So it's pretty much stopped taking Syrian refugees officially. And before that, the closer you are to the conflict of 2011, the more Jordan was generous in terms of giving health care and some housing assistance and some food assistance. But as time went on, those resources decreased, in part because they're just the international community, including the United States, was not doing its fair share. Europe was telling the Middle Eastern countries, keep those refugees there. Oh, and we're not going to provide you with any humanitarian aid. So it's all on you. And as many, those of you who know about the Middle Eastern countries, their economies are struggling. They have very high unemployment rates. They have their GDP is low. And so these are not countries that are already doing well economically that they can afford to absorb all of these refugees without some form of international assistance. So at this point in time, most of the what we call dependent humanitarian assistance has dried up for many of these refugees, and they're just trying to survive. You have multiple families living in small apartments. Rents in Amman and other urban areas have gone up 300 to 400% because there's such a high demand for places to live, and that has angered the native population, the citizens. Because imagine if you had an influx of people coming to Washington, D.C., and suddenly your rent is now triple what it was because the landlords can get away with it because there's such a high demand. So that has created some social and political tensions, and at the same time, Jordan took in one of the largest numbers of Iraqi refugees. And the Iraqi refugees were a direct result of our occupation of Iraq. We have to be honest about this. We went into Iraq to depose Saddam Hussein, who was a brutal dictator, by means that are arguably against international law. And as a result, we triggered a massive refugee crisis, and we emboldened and strengthened Al-Qaeda, which then eventually merged into ISIS and Daesh. Much of what we're seeing, instability, is caused or was triggered by our going into the region. That is not a defense. I'm not making a statement of defense in what I'm saying. I'm just simply stating that you have to analyze the consequences, and you have to be ready for them. And we, as a country, have not faced any of those consequences. We've taken very few Iraqi refugees in, taken very few Syrian refugees in, and yet we are going and sending militaries there and creating havoc and ruining people's lives. And the vast majority, we're talking 80 to 90% of the victims of Daesh and Al-Qaeda are Muslims. They are not Americans, they're not British, they're not German, not Italian. That's not who gets killed by these extremists and these terrorists. The American media would like you to believe that so that you can support bad policy. Prejudice. Okay. So with regard to the funds, so our report primarily addresses, we decided that it was probably a non-starter to try to ask the Trump administration and recommend that the Trump administration increase the number of refugees from Syria to the United States. He's decreased the total number down below the 20,000. It's the lowest in history of the United States. That's just the count. And then the Syrians are even lower. Since 2017, the number of Muslim refugees has gone down. We only have 5,000 Muslim refugees and 23,000 Christian refugees. So this is a very purposeful Islamophobic refugee policy. It's anti-refugee in general, and it's anti-Muslim specifically. And most Syrians are Muslim, whether they're Shia or they're Sunni, but it's like 99%, or excuse me, probably 95, because there is a large Christian community, so 90%. So we contribute $1.3 billion to Jordan in military aid and foreign aid, and half of that goes to economic aid, most of it is military aid. As of 2019, the U.S. State Department committed $397 million to the Syrian refugee crisis, and that's compared to $697 million in 2017. So the 2017 policy is based on the long one, because it takes about a year. So you cut it in half over 2 years. Even though the refugee crisis, they can't go home. It's unsafe. And as Professor Austin stated, there's an international norm of the customary law of non-refoulement, which effectively prohibits states from returning refugees to any location where they will face human rights violations. And as long as the Assad regime is in power, what he has done is he has punished those who have fled because he's treated them as traitors. And many of them have sons, or they are male age, adult age when they left, and he is prosecuting them for fleeing conscription. Once you get into a Syrian jail, it is a brutal, brutal death. It's a torturous, torturous death, and you will disappear. It is a nightmare. So going back to Syria, especially under the Assad control areas, is a non-starter for the international human rights. It's just an outrageous proposition. Now let's compare that to Turkey. It has spent $37 billion since 2000 on Syria. $37 billion. The EU committed, now so in 2016, which was when the refugee crisis was going to Europe, so many of the 1 million that are currently in Europe, they all went, most of them, before 2016. And then in 2016, the EU and Turkey made a deal, and they said, look, stop sending them to us. Close your border and give them, and we'll give you money. They committed $6 billion. They've only paid 2.75 billion euros. So again, we're just balancing this. I'm not making these statements to be apologetic towards Turkey because I'll have my critique in a minute of their policies right now. But I think we have to know the facts that this is a country that has spent an inordinate amount of money that no one else has. And I think that it's we as U.S. citizens, if we really care about Syrian refugees, we need to have our country be part of the solution rather than point fingers. Because my biggest concern is that if Turkey is not assisted by the international community, then they are going to do one of two things, as they've already started. They're going to push them out of Turkey back to Syria, or they're going to push them into Europe, where they're not safe there either. And Hungary's put up its walls, everybody's just putting up their walls, and most of them will be drowning at sea. If you're thinking about the interests of the Syrian refugees, it's not in their interest to be kicked out of Turkey. Most of them, by the way, at some point do want to go home. If there was a safe Syria today, many of them want to go home. Not to the northeastern safe zone, because as Professor Austin said, that's not their home. Syria is a different country. Okay. So just finally, with regard to the recommendations we made to the U.S. government, is what we found is there's a agreement. It's not a perfect agreement. It's not flawless. Called the Jordan Compact between the EU and Jordan. And what the EU did, again, as part of trying to incentivize the Middle Eastern countries to keep the refugees in their countries and keep the borders closed and not let them go to Europe, was to provide them with some aid. Well, it's a fascinating compact because it essentially ties the aid to empowerment of refugees. So you have to give them more permits. You have to make sure they have access to education, some minimum amount of health care. Therefore, we're not recommending that the U.S. simply just give money, especially in places where corruption is very high, and you have no idea where some of that aid will end up. It will probably be in the pockets of elite politicians and dictators. But having it where, for example, the aid can be tied to more trade between the countries, special treatment for companies that want to locate there and create jobs, maybe create a branch. IKEA did that and created a branch there, and they're based on the terms of the Jordan Compact. That IKEA received some concessionary loans. They had to employ a certain percentage of Syrian refugees as well as Jordanian citizens, so that the Jordanian citizens would be upset because there's a high unemployment rate in Jordan. And then they produced the goods, and then the goods were tariff-free, and they could be exported. So there's ways to incentivize and use those funds so that you can help both the low-income native citizens, because those are who suffer the most when people flood into the informal market doing low-wage work, and you can also help the Syrian refugees. So I will let you all read our report to get all of the details. So let me just quickly mention why, combine quick geopolitical analysis of Turkey, but one of the things that's happening in Turkey right now is similar to many of these other countries, is they're getting fatigued by the citizens. Turkish citizens, I would say, for the first 5, 6, maybe even 7 years, were quite empathetic and open and welcoming to the Syrian refugees. And the AKP, which is Erdogan's party, which, for lack of a better term, we call political Islamists, they were very pro-Syrian refugee. They were very savvy in identifying or understanding that many if you look at the border of Syria and Turkey, there are multiple factories, because Syrians have crafts and they have a strength in clothing. They used to export clothing factories. They relocated those factories into Turkey, and now Turkey is economically benefiting from it. They are bringing in profits, taxing those profits, employing Turks as well as the Syrian refugees. So we're very smart about thinking of them not as a liability, but more as an asset. However, in 2018, the Turkish economy fell into a recession, and the lira fell by 30%. And that started to cause tensions. At that point, as Turks were starting to suffer from the economic malaise, and they're seeing, especially in Istanbul, 500,000 children of Syrian refugees, and they're asking themselves, like many people would, why we can't afford this? We've had these refugees for almost 10 years now. Europe has shirked its responsibility. America has shirked its responsibility. Even Canada's publicity about bringing them in, it's 59,000. That's nothing. Canada could bring in another 200,000. We could bring in another 200,000. So what's happening is there's this political pressure on Erdogan internally, and his party just lost the mayoral elections in Istanbul. He used to be the mayor of Istanbul, so it's a very personal loss to him. So the other party in Turkey's had a history of the Kemalists and the secularists. So the political Islamists have always had this conversation with the secularists. Anyway, point being is he's got an internal problem. The other issue, which Professor Austin mentioned, is the PKK, which we designated as a terrorist organization in the West. They designated it. And the Turkish narrative, the Turkish perspective or the Turkish government's perspective, is that the YPG, which is some would call it a militia group, some would call it a resistance group. I'm a national security expert, so one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. So whatever you want to call them. This is a Kurdish group in Syria that are Syrians, and my understanding is they've been in operation since 2004 at least, so long before the Arab Spring. And the Turkish government's perspective is that's the Syrian component of the PKK. And the YPG is part of the Syrian Democratic Forces, among many, many other groups. So Turkey is claiming, look, you've got the PKK that's trying to engage in a violent resistance against the Turkish government, similar to in Ireland, and these folks are going to now try to create an autonomous region, a Kurdish region in northeast Syria, and they're going to use that as a base to then try to attack us in the southeast part of Turkey, where most of the Kurds are, and this is all part of a very big conspiracy to essentially take away and cede that land and create the Kurdistan that they've always wanted, and that they had been promised right after World War I, but the international community betrayed them. So the Kurds have a long history of being betrayed. It's very sad. I think the Americans did betray them, what we did. But that's his explanation in terms of, he's got two things, is I've got 3.6 million refugees and my people are starting to turn against me and I'm going to start losing power through democratic elections. And I've got this terrorist group that most of society, and there's a strong anti-PKK sentiment in Turkey. And so here's a great solution. I'm just going to create the safe zone, push out the Kurds, because they're predominantly in the northern part, bring in the Syrians who are not from there, not from that part of Syria, correct? And possibly even have the land grab and get But that's their narrative, so there's a lot going on here. And we're happy to answer more questions during the Q&A. But finally, just really quickly with the legal implications, international law is not reliable. International law is difficult to define and even more difficult to enforce. And most enforcement is through diplomatic means and real politique and hard power in terms of saying, if you do this, we're going to sanction you if you go ahead. But to the extent that we can identify some international treaties, so Article 33 of the Refugee Convention codifies the customary norm of non-refoulement. Thus far, Erdogan's claim is I'm not forcibly removing them, I'm trying to get them to voluntarily go. You don't have to believe that, but that's his story. The 1948 UN Convention on Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide, Article 2, defines genocide as an intent to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. I don't think there's a case to be made that he's trying to destroy the Kurds. I think there might be a case to be made that he's trying to massacre or at the very least dilute them. Because if you look at the maps, they're concentrated in the southeast part of Turkey, the northeast part of Syria, the northwest part of Iraq and Iran, because that's essentially the nation states for the site to speak over. And then you have the Article 7.1d of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and that is where you might have a little bit of room for legal argumentation, which makes deportation or forcible transfer of populations a crime against humanity. The problem is that Turkey is not a state party to the Rome Statute, and therefore the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction. And neither does the United States, a state party to the Rome Convention. So Turkey is no different than the U.S. in that regard. However, there is a workaround, which is if the United Nations Security Council issues a resolution determining that war crime or genocide has occurred or crime against humanity has occurred, and then refers it to the prosecutor of the ICC, then arguably they would have jurisdiction, except Russia and the US are on the Security Council, and it's very unlikely that that's good. There's also the International National Court of Justice, but that's usually been state to state, and again, they have some advisor. So it's possible, but international law is something that is not as easy to pursue as in the domestic context. And I think the question is, right now, Turkey has backed off a bit because of the so-called deal between Russia and Turkey, and in terms of our Poland troops, I think it's going to be hard to argue that we aided and abetted. And again, the United States' position historically has been very anti-international law. And the reason is because we would probably get convicted of certain crimes. So relying on the US government to try to press an enforcement of these types of international law norms is not going to be easy. And I wouldn't rely on the US government, maybe other governments, maybe European governments. But generally speaking, it's not very hopeful. So on that note, I just want to end and say that the fact that you're here is really important. It means that you care, it means that you want to be informed. But as a law professor, I'm a lawyer, and I study authoritarian regimes, and I live in a relatively democratic country. If you don't hold your government accountable, then we're just going to sit here and talk about problems, and nothing is going to change. And you need to at least face the reality that you are just as much responsible for these bad policies as the government officials that are making them, because they rely on you being uninformed, unengaged, compliant, and apathetic. The more you do that, the more they can get away with whatever they want. So I hope that you will feel empowered after this. You're informing yourself, you read more, but you also have to do something and speak to these people that work here with our permission, paid with our taxpayer dollars, that we don't want to be the country that takes 20,000 while other countries are taking millions of refugees. Thank you.
Morning. Thank you so much. As was mentioned earlier, I'm Imam Bukkit. I'm the senior staff attorney at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Thank you all for coming out this morning. I'm going to keep my remarks brief because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. And my remarks are going to be grounding everything that has been stated today in U.S. policy and in what is happening here with respect to Syrian refugees. So the question becomes, well, are there any Syrian refugees? Well, we just heard there's about 20,000. That's not very much, not even much. And we also know that the U.S. has been doing a lot of policy writing in recent years vis-a-vis not only Syria, but Syrian refugees in particular. And so I'm going to be going over what U.S. policy is with respect to Syrian refugees and also what we can do to maybe hold Turkey accountable and what we can do to maybe encourage the resettlement of Syrian refugees in a peaceful and orderly way and in compliance with international law. So the first question is, what is the U.S. position on Syrian refugees? So this might be very obvious, but there is, of course, a very explicit and aggressive position, which is that we have a hard ban on all Syrian refugees. So the United States of America today, Supreme Court, posting on June 26, 2018, upheld what is now infamously known as the Muslim ban. And that ban is the law, which means that no Syrian refugees have been allowed into the United States as a matter of law. In fact, there are no visas, immigrant or non-immigrant, that have been issued to any Syrians and cannot be issued. That is the law of the land today. So that's very important to understand. The United States has not only made it illegal for people to come into this country who are Syrian refugees and who are from Syria, but we actually have projected across the planet that Syrian refugees are to be vilified. There's something fundamentally wrong with Syrian refugees. When we know that on 9/11, not a single one of the hijackers was Syrian. They never attacked us on 9/11. They're not part of that whole experience. But somehow we conflate all of that into this big, horrible Islamophobic, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab discourse. So it's important to understand that. So that's the first piece, is that is the law. I think a lot of people don't quite get that is actually the situation. We have waivers that can be given out, but only about 5% of waivers are issued. So most of those are rejected flatly. So where does that leave the few that are here, right? So there are a few Syrian refugees that are here, and ABC actually works with a lot of them. There's one particular community that I will discuss. There's about 500 families that have resettled in the Pittsburgh area, right outside Pittsburgh. So what we see is the federal government not necessarily welcoming refugees, but we have certain governors and mayors that have, at least to the extent that they can, welcome them. So the governor there in Pittsburgh said, or the mayor, I'm sorry, in Pittsburgh said that he wants to welcome Syrian refugees, and so he put in place all kinds of programs, and there are about 500 families that are resettled there. There's low-income housing that is available to them without any kind of subsidies issued, and there's also no wait time. The county is struggling though. Allegheny County out in Pittsburgh is struggling because it's a sort of a bit of a culture shock. There's not a lot of Syrians, there's not a lot of Arabs in that area. So we've gone in and helped with some cultural competency education. I would love that word, cultural competency, but we go in and we try to basically explain that a lot of these folks have come in with PTSD. A lot of the kids are suffering from all kinds of trauma, and so that's one community in particular. They're also suffering from a lot of bigotry, right? Because of this rhetoric at the federal level that's been put out there, right? So despite the fact that there is a wonderful mayor who's trying to do the right thing at the state level and at the local level, we still have this overwhelming negative narrative that is giving people on the ground a lot of power and is allowing them to be bigoted. So we have stories of, for example, one particular Syrian refugee child who was wrongfully charged with something that was innocuous that every other child does, which is play a video on his phone about, it was an Arabic video and it happened to have some graphic language, and so he was literally charged with a felony for that. We had to go up there and say, this is not a felony, this is just a rap video in Arabic. So it's okay, not be scared. Not everything that is Arabic is terrorism. So there are some issues with the resettlement process, but the United States, like Turkey, it's unlike Turkey in every way except for this one, where basically it's taken in very few refugees, but it does allow Syrian refugees to work, provides work authorization to them, and also provides work authorization to the 5,800 Syrians who have TPS. It also does provide a minimum stipend. It's not really enough for them to get their food up and going, but it's definitely, I think a lot of it has to do with the communities really understanding the facts, which is that Syrian refugees that are leaving Syria are leaving the worst humanitarian disaster on the planet. It was a horrific experience what has happened there. The country has been razed. Entire villages have been flattened. They have nowhere to go. It's not even comparable to what's happened in Iraq or Afghanistan. So it's very important for people to know that, when I tell school teachers or when I speak to your bosses, whether it's in the House or in the Senate, I usually tell them, this is not like any other humanitarian disaster. This is the worst in the world. It's worse than World War II. So it's important that we understand that they can go back, and also that there's massive trauma that these kids and the adults are going through it. So we really tried to push for social services support and also for more translators in that area. So those are some of the challenges in the United States. And again, I just urge you to really remember that words do matter. Because even when there's people on the ground trying to do the right thing, when they're constantly hearing from the bully pulpit poisonous language that is afactual about Syrians coming here to kill everyone, it's just ridiculous, and it should be called out. So that's a little bit about the work in Pittsburgh and one specific community and how they've been dealing with trying to get their lives together. They're trying to work and they're trying to go to school, and how they're trying to adjust to the American way of life. There is one other thing I will mention, which is this, again, constantly seeing people who are coming from, people who are suffering from mental health issues, and this is obvious to everybody, right? Like if you're coming from a war zone and you just walked across multiple countries and finally made it here, whether it was going to Jordan, staying in a refugee camp for 2-3 years, and finally making it here and having lost everything, if not your own limbs and maybe some family members, then it's obvious that those people are going to have a lot of trauma. And so instead of seeing things through a medical lens, a lot of times our government, again, the federal government, has been over-policing, particularly this community in Pittsburgh is one example. And so we have the FBI coming in and seeing everything through a national security lens. So another challenge that this community is having, just to use them as an example, is that you have the FBI aggressively over-policing. So you have them constantly coming into their homes, knocking on their doors for these voluntary interviews because they actually don't have anything concrete that they're investigating. So they're just saying, oh yeah, we're here to just talk to you. How you doing? And they have no idea. Syrian refugees are just like, hi, what can we do? Did you do something wrong? Because they come from an authoritarian nation where they've been traumatized, right? Where if the government comes to your home in Syria, that means you're in big trouble, right? You don't say no to the Mukhabarat, right? You don't say no to the secret police. That's the equivalent of the FBI there. And so you have, again, this seeing things through a national security lens with the federal government, again, over-policing and this negative rhetoric and these aggressive policies against refugees really trickling down even when we have local communities at the state level trying to do right by their own values. So I think it's really important to peel back a lot of these negative policies, and to also remember that this is not a national security issue. This is a humanitarian issue. It's a mental health issue, and it's also a medical issue. So so those are, again, that's a little bit more about the Syrian population here. I'll say one more thing about so not only do we have about the status of the law, so we have this hard ban on Syrian refugees, but we also know that there's other policies that the Trump administration has passed where they've made it extremely difficult for asylum seekers to come into the country, right? So you have to, it's the so-called third country rule, where you have to go to a third country before you come into the United States. You won't be allowed into the country. So if you're coming from, say, Syria, if you went through Turkey, you would have to apply for asylum in Turkey, got rejected there, and then you would be allowed to at least try to come into the United States if you tried to come through the border safely, right? So again, they're making it very difficult. And now I think that's in litigation. I'm not sure if there's an injunction or not. But, so the United States, these policies at the national level really need to be halted. And so that leads me to my my final, I guess, my third point, which is what we can do, right? So the federal government has a lot of power in this country. The executive branch has massive authority, but Congress is the first branch of government. It's Article 1, right, of the Constitution goes to Congress. You have the purse strings, you have the right to make laws, you have the right to really direct a lot of important policies. So there's a lot that Congress can do, and I think the resolution that was passed a couple weeks ago about the Armenian genocide is very important because, as was stated, it's unbelievable that there are currently war crimes taking place on the very land where Armenian blood was spilled by the same people, right? By the Turkish military, or at least Turkish-backed militias. So I think it's really important because that sends a signal that we're not going to tolerate a Kurdish or Syrian Arab genocide in northern Syria. So that was positive. Hopefully the Senate will do the same thing. That would be helpful. I think another concrete thing that the House did was pass HR 4695, which was introduced by Representative Engel, and it passed 403 to 16, and that was to protect to protect civilians against the atrocities there. And I think that was positive to really put sanctions on Turkey, and the sanctions I think were appropriate in this case because as Professor Aziz said, it's important to appreciate that Turkey has done a lot, and they don't have indefinite, they don't have their coffers, their tax dollars in Turkey are just like ours. They're precious and they're finite. And so they've given out a lot of money to Syrians. They've supported them, but at the same time, you have to be realistic that they have to look out for their own as well. And they have political pressures internally in Turkey. There's an election coming up, so Erdogan has to appease, his constituents. And there's nothing like an external conflict to unite the people, right? So, and there's nothing that really unifies Turks like going after those evil Kurds who are terrorists. So I think there's a lot of politics there, but at the same time, I think these sanctions were appropriate because they were tailored and they were fighting. So they don't go after Turks writ large, they go after Halk Bank, the state-owned bank, and they really go after financial institutions that are facilitating arms and they're supporting the military. So it's important that kind of tailored type sanctioning takes place at the Senate level as well, if the Senate passes theirs. I know that Lindsey Graham and the representative of Congress, Senator Van Hollen, introduced their own bill, and hopefully that will go through. But I think it's important to keep those sanctions tailored because while on the one hand we want to punish Turkey for these atrocities, we also want to encourage Turkey to invest in Syrians who are already resettled there. while many Syrian refugees might want to go back to Syria, there's a lot of them that are still there and it's not realistic to believe that they're actually going to go back. So it's important for us to encourage certain companies that are responsible, that are doing important work in Turkey to also continue to do that and to continue to perhaps support those specific industries. But that's something that's going to have to come maybe from the private sector. So, but we don't want the federal government to make it more difficult to invest in those areas. If that makes sense. So I think that that's a really sort of technical and policy point that I'm saying. So that's another thing that hopefully the Senate will do. We know that there's currently an executive order, whether the Senate passes or not, passes their sanctions bill, the executive order on October 14th that was passed by the president sanctioning Turkey. The sanctions are in place. Again, going after certain military officials, etc. And so I think that's very important because the U.S. is putting pressure and saying this is not okay. But at the same time, we know that the U.S. is talking out of both sides of it's not, because we say we care, but not really. I mean, let's just move our troops to where the oil is. And let's not really have diplomatic relations with Syria. And it's difficult because we have to be honest, and let's not take in any Syrian refugees. So it seems like we only like to be punitive in our approaches instead of being constructive. And I think we might consider maybe reestablishing some kind of, I know that there were a couple of things that were discussed earlier about possible regional reconciliation. I think that we see diplomatic ties being reestablished with UAE having their diplomatic ties set up in Syria. They have their ambassador there now. We have Bahrain that have reopened their embassy in Damascus. The Saudis are thinking about it. The Jordanians have their ambassador back in Damascus. I'm not saying that the U.S. needs to necessarily do that. We have our special envoy who's doing plenty. But I think that Arab countries, we can put pressure on our Arab allies to do more. That's certainly, I think, the least they can do. These are very wealthy Gulf nations in particular who can do more. They haven't taken in the number of refugees that Jordan and Lebanon have and Turkey have. And those are countries that can afford to absorb more people. And they can also certainly afford to invest more in the reconstruction of Syria. And if they do invest in reconstructing Syria, then Syrian refugees would be able to actually go back home to their actual cities where they're from, not just to the northern region where Erdogan wants to force them into Arabization. And so I think that that's something that I wanted to maybe put out there. It's obviously a difficult thing to do, but the U.S. can reestablish itself as a leader in the world by actually talking to its allies in the region and saying, we need to really get serious about rebuilding this country because it can't just stay the way it is. And certainly we know that Russia and Iran are not going to be able to rebuild that country, and Turkey doesn't have the means to do it. They don't have the kind of capital that those countries do in the Gulf region in particular, but not just those countries, others as well. So that's diplomatic pressure that can be put through the State Department. I don't know how realistic that is, but we can certainly do stuff here in the House and the Senate to put pressure on our allies. And I think it's just vital to just lift the Syrian refugee ban, lift the ban generally. I think we have to stop this kind of absurdity, these draconian laws that are designed to vilify for political gain. I think let's hope that chapter is behind us. This odious chapter is behind us, and we can move on and move forward to really rebuilding an America that we can actually be proud of. Because it's absolutely shameful that our country vilifies the most vulnerable people on the planet. And I say that from experience with my clients who live here, who are treated as if there's something fundamentally wrong with him because he's a child that happens to be Syrian. It's really incredible how the rhetoric is impacting and the policy is impacting people's views. So I really hope that we can pass the No Ban Act. I know the House has already done really good work in getting most people to sign on there, at least the Democrats. The Senate, it's going to be a tough fight, but at least getting the conversation going is important. So with that, I think we'll open it up for questions. I think Amanda, our superstar legal fellow, is going to be walking around with the mic. So just keep the questions, short, concise, please, so we can take as many people as possible. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Teresa Yeromian. I'm with the Armenian National Committee of America. I wanted to thank you, Iman and Dr. Holmes, for your comments, for the discussion today, and for putting this together. We're part of the team that helped pass the genocide resolution we've been working on for years, 2 decades, to get it passed. And we agree with you. This situation is a repetition of history, it's a repetition of land grab, repetition of genocide, if not ethnic cleansing, in that region what's taking place today. My question is directed to the visit Erdogan is expected to be president next week. What is the ABC expecting to do expecting out of that meeting, and if we're planning any activity for that visit?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, and again, congratulations on that historic resolution. Really, I mean, it took generations, right, to get that. And it's really amazing. We sent out a press release supporting that very important resolution. I think it's really tough with President Erdogan because he has his own political agenda, and he knows that he has a lot of leverage and a lot of power right now. So we're hopeful that he'll do the right thing and respect international law, and that he will continue to really respect the values that he says that he's all about. He's all about humanitarianism and helping Syrians, and he talks out of, like I said, both sides of his mouth. And we're going to try to put pressure on him to stop killing, stop being proven, back off, to pull out and to allow for real discussions between different countries to come to fruition and for some kind of serious reconstruction. You can't force people to go back to a place that's not real. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Congratulations on getting the resolution passed. I personally wish it would have been passed, the Armenian genocide resolution would have been passed decades ago, but I'm glad that it happened now. While survivors are still alive, right? While some of the survivors are still alive, it is, however, extremely hypocritical that if we were to allow, literally in the same region, the same city where the Armenian genocide happened, around Masalan and Serekan, that region, for the similar atrocities to happen. And so that's why it's absolutely necessary that we pressure the Senate to also adopt the Armenian genocide resolution, but also the other sanctions that Iman mentioned against Turkey. They should be targeted. I fully agree they should be targeted. And I would again recommend targeting these Turkish-backed rebel groups like Ahrar Shakir that assassinated Hadrin Khalaf, a Syrian Kurdish civilian politician, while she was driving in her car on the M4 highway. This is unacceptable, these kinds of war crimes, and they should not be tolerated. We need to make Turkey, recognize that if these are happening under the command of groups that they essentially are, working with. I mean, the Turkish army, they moved into Syria, and then if you can see how they've been coordinating with these groups. So this is the first thing, and the second thing that I think is important to mention is that this Turkish occupation of, first of all, Afrin in the northwest, but began in January 2018, but now also the region that they've currently moved into around Halabja and Farai. The local Syrians, not just the Kurds, but the Syrians won't accept that. They won't accept a Turkish occupation of Syria. And that will be a disputed territory. If Turkey does not get pushed out, pushed back across the border into Turkey, it will be a disputed territory. And we know what happened in disputed territories in Iraq, for example. What what happened in Sinjar, Shanghai. The genocide against the refugees happened in Sinjar. Why? One reason that it happened there is because it was a disputed territory. It was not clear who exactly is responsible for protecting the region. Who exactly is responsible for protecting the Yazidis? Is it Erbil? Is it Baghdad? Is it the Peshmerga? Is it the Iraqi army? So one of the reasons why the genocide happened against the Yazidis in 2014 in Sinjar is because it was not clear who was responsible for that region. And so we should do everything possible to prevent the creation of disputed territories in Syria. That this is why this will be a generational problem if it's not resolved. And so it's not too late that we put pressure on Turkey and the Turkish-backed rebels, and that we demand they be removed from this region, because it's absolutely unacceptable.
So a couple things just to think about in terms of the meeting. First is that Trump does not care what it hurts. He doesn't care about humans. He's not going to be walking in there. I do not anticipate expecting him to walk in there and say, how can I protect the votes? Trump is, to his credit, very openly Machiavellian and local elite style. So he's going to be looking at how can I get the Turks to pay? If somebody wants us to put in more troops, how can I get money? I think what the Turks want, well, obviously they want sanctions lifted, or any additional sanctions lifted, and no new sanctions added. But they also want intelligence and counterterrorism collaboration with the sophisticated capabilities on the YPG and the PKK to the extent they're involved as well when it comes to Syria. That's going to be, I think, two top priorities. Give me more intel, let me have access to it, satellites, and et cetera. And also sanction it. Those whatever sanctions exist. I think the other leverage that he's got, and he's correctly open very long, he's going to open those borders. So I think he was also probably talking to Trump and saying, we can't let him open those borders. If he's really serious about that, there will be mass migration to Europe. And so Erdogan may try to also negotiate for more aid, for more funds for the Syrian refugees. I'm speculating, but I think we just have to be realistic that unfortunately neither of the two parties are that concerned with the human rights of Kurds. And at the same time, there doesn't seem to be any movement or any progress on resolving the Syrian conflict. It's the stagnation that it's in. It's a cesspool for more and more violence, and protracts and extends the ability of, delays the ability of any Syrian refugees to come home. There will be a tipping point, probably in the third generation, where you won't want to go home because you won't be there. Right now, when we talk to Syrian refugees in Jordan, it was very consistent. We want to go home. Syria is our home. We like Jordan. They're our cousins. The Jordanians are hospitable to us. They're grateful to the Jordanians, their neighbors. They want to go home. But at some point, that's going to change, and then you have a different
Hi, my name is Rania Kaiser. I'm the girl from Idlib, the girl that cried out for America on CNN. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for all the comments, for the precise information that you gave to the media here. There's something that I was waiting for you to say that I didn't hear all three of you when you talk about, which is the refugee situation in the Northwest. The bombardment that's taking place right now on Idlib. Yesterday, 23 towns got shelled. Every day, thousands of people are getting killed in Idlib. They're organizing caravans to go to Turkey. So as far as Erdogan is concerned, if he's going to open up his borders to Europe, he's going to have to open up his borders in the south. Because the people are going to go crazy. The people are already crazy. everybody from the south of Idlib has moved up at least, I want to say 40 kilometers. I just came from there. It's horrendous. People are under the trees. You know, I agree with everything that you said about the United States government and its apathy, but it's not just the apathy of the United States government, it's also the apathy of the people. I can't thank all of you. I am honored to have been just invited and come to listen to all of you. I'm honored. I think there needs to be a stronger action. I think we need to just immediately sit down and decide how we're going to change the opinions of the decision makers here on what's going on in the Northwest. On the borders of Turkey right now, there's 850,000 people under the trees. On the borders, I saw them. Under the trees, it's getting cold. The houses that they have, I just spoke to my girlfriend today, Sahar. She used to live in Cairo, and she used to have a beautiful home. Her husband used to sell birds. Now she's living in a no window, no door apartment that's built in bricks only. So no windows. What are we doing about the Northwest? For God's sake, I understand the problem with the Kurds. I love them. I wrote a post about Hebrew, and I was attacked. And I'm supposed to be an icon for the Northwest. I got so attacked because I wrote that we lost a sister. But at the same time, Amy, they're committing crimes as well. They're killing people as well. Not all the videos are fabricated. We've lost our minds. We have gone crazy. We will continue to kill each other. But accounting Ahrar Sharqiya as terrorists and not also holding the other side accountable for the crimes that we are also feeling around, forget the media. We have families that we lost going towards their areas.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You have other questions? Do you have time for how many more?
Yeah. About 30 minutes.
Thank you for your comments today. Peter Burns with Syrian Christians. We've been tracking the situation developing in all regions, of course, but specifically there's a community in Lebanon of children being born who are not receiving, children being born to displaced Syrian refugees who are not receiving paperwork. There's sort of a 4 or 5 step process they would need to go through, sort of culminating with Syrian consulate giving them sort of state papers. So basically, you're having a burgeoning population of children who really don't have a state. What is sort of the future of this community? Who's talking about this, thinking about sort of what happens to children who are now stateless?
This is a phenomenon that is actually a real problem across the region. And that's been one of the reasons why, so there's multiple reasons why Syrians are not returning. To the extent that it's feasible to return to maybe certain parts of the country. And so one is the conscription, because there was a point where they thought, okay, it's died down and the conflict is at least there isn't just outright violence. Notwithstanding that is, one was the conscription issue, the fear of being prosecuted for conscription. The other issue, and that's also in Jordan, but Lebanon is probably the worst case scenario for many of the Syrian refugees in the region, because it's the country that's not, it's a very anti-Syrian refugee environment politically. They have not received any services. Many of them were either forced into camps, and they're not getting the papers. Right? So many of them are stateless. And I don't know what the solution is. The problem right now is there's no way, unless the Lebanese government wants to give them something, but none of these countries want these refugees to have any status that would allow them to stay permanent. Okay? And so to the extent that the Lebanese government gives them something that would then give them a legal basis for saying I'm permanent resident or I'm a citizen, they won't do it, particularly on these countries, because of the Palestinian refugee crisis. So, it might need to be solved internationally, but I think that at this point, I'm of the view that we need to go to the root of the problem, and the international community needs to resolve the Syrian conflict. But the biggest problem is between Russia and the United States. You've got the proxies and Iran, but the proxy governments, Russia and Iran, support the Assad regime, and then you've got both countries and the United States that claim they don't support the Assad regime, and it's gotten so much more complicated. But at this point, if we don't resolve this conflict, whether we're going to split the country, whether we're going to push out Assad, we're just going to continue having to live with the problems.
Hi, I'm Lauren Homer with Lawn Liberty Trust. I'm sorry. I'm Lauren Homer with Lawn Liberty Trust. I've been involved in Syria for 10 years. And as you were saying, the U.S. basically stood back and allowed Erdogan to go in to fulfill his threats. We blocked a Security Council resolution condemning Turkey. And so right now, those of us who are still trying to campaign for some survival of the people in the Northeast, because that's all we can hope for right now. We're focusing on Senate passage of the Armenian genocide resolution, a no-fly zone, which seems improbable, but we're still trying for that, and a resolution about Erdogan's apparently still going to come next Wednesday to the U.S., and I hope that there will be a huge amount of people who will go to the White House to protest his presence in the U.S. It's hard to know, but I mean, I'm wondering if you guys have any big picture solutions, not just talking about this, which we've been doing for years now, and our worst fears are being realized. But are there any other ideas on the table about what we can actually do to stop it?
Yeah, I can try to address that, and also the question of Idlib, which you raised, which is very important. I mean, in terms of big picture solution, it's very difficult, obviously, because Syria is essentially one country, four systems or something. But I would say that one thing we can do is to pressure for the northeast, the SDF-controlled region, the Syrian Democratic Council, to be included in the Geneva talks, because they have actually been saying for years that they want to be part of that constitution writing committee. And so I actually think this is a misperception about the Kurds or the northeast of Syria. I think there's some, people tend to believe that Kurds in Syria must have the same ambitions as Kurds in Iraq, because the Iraqi Kurds, they held a referendum in September 2017 to declare, to find out if they would want to have an independent Kurdish state in northern Iraq. And so I think a lot of people, unfortunately, in Washington, D.C. and also in the region believe that Syrian Kurds must want the same thing, and that's actually not the case. They're not separatists. They've been asking for years to be included in the Constitution Writing Committee in Geneva. They want to be part of that. And so, the United States and the European Union and all of our allies should really, I think, pressure for that to happen, because for 1/3 of Syria, they control 1/3 of the country in the northeast, to just be excluded from the talks over the future of Syria. I mean, that's unacceptable, I think. So I think the more political pressure for them to be included in those talks would be important. Regarding Idlib, I mean, it's a perfect, example of the atrocities that happen when the regime has taken back territory. Because when we see, and this is what I think may be repeated in the Northeast if the regime is able to come back and take back territory in the Northeast. I mean, so far as we understand, the regime, along with Russia, has deployed to the border between Turkey and Syria. So my understanding is that they're not yet inside the cities of the northeast. If the U.S. had not withdrawn, for example, perhaps, I've gotten emails from people from Idlib who I've never met, who just strangers emailing me, asking me for help to get out of Idlib. It's a horrible situation. So I can't imagine what it must be like for you, but it's just a horrible situation to see this unfold, and no one does anything, nothing happens. It's horrible. If the U.S. had not withdrawn, perhaps it would still be possible for us or our coalition partners to find a way for people from Idlib to come into SDF territory if Turkey doesn't open the border. Yeah, or to create some kind of a corridor, humanitarian corridor where to allow people to escape. That would be the least we could do. Just allow people to escape, to get away from the shelling, etc., the bombings that are happening.
I wish I had solutions. It's such a complicated situation, but a couple of things I want to highlight. So first, we all know that we've got elections coming up here in the United States. And Trump's move was connected to that to a large extent. Maybe there are other factors at play. Maybe he's playing this game with Erdogan and he's trying to get leverage out of there. But I think that he made it pretty clear that we don't want to be in these endless wars. That is a very Republican, right-leaning motto or narrative. And so he's trying to feed that part of his base, is that I'm going to pull the troops out as part of my promise, and I'm following that commitment. Maybe that will also distract you from the impeachment investigation inquiry. It's also a master of distraction. The second, that we can't talk about Syria without talking about Iran. Iran has a very strong interest in keeping the Assad regime in place. They have engaged in a regional political conflict with the Gulf countries and for regional hegemony. And the Gulf has now started to ally more with Israel and the United States into this. And so Iran wants to continue its stronghold on Syria. You know about the connection with Hezbollah. So you can't analyze it without understanding the region. And what we did, which was I think a really foolish move, is right when Obama was starting to bring Iran into the tent through the nuclear deal, then Trump kicked them out. And so now Iran has absolutely no incentive to cooperate with the United States, absolutely no incentive to try to work on fixing the conflict or addressing the conflict in Syria, and has every interest in doing whatever it can, whatever it has to keep the Assad regime in power. And as you talked about with Idlib, Assad is at this point, Assad has to go, and that regime has to go. It's going to create a lot of other issues where we've got to figure out what's the transitional justice, how do we make sure that the military doesn't become a spoiler, how it doesn't end up like Iraq and go into a sectarian civil war. But the regime at this point is, I realize I'm not Syrian American, so I realize that now I've made some enemies. But I just think geopolitically at this point it's unsustainable. But my point is, if you want to focus on U.S. policy, you've got to focus on the U.S. policy with Iran, because you've got to get Iran on board, and you've got to get the Saudis and the Gulfies to start playing nice in the sandbox with Iran and stop acting like adolescents and at the stake of the Syrian refugees, at the stake of many of these civilians who've been caught in the conflict. And then finally, if we're going to have a corridor, and we're going to provide a safety, a space where they can escape, which presumably they would escape to Lebanon or they would escape to Turkey, then we have to bring in Syrian refugees here. We cannot, in good faith, go and tell these countries who have 5.6 million refugees already, who suffer from unemployment rates in the double digits, whose GDPs are debt, who have high national debt, and say, hey, why don't you guys take all these refugees, and we'll take nothing. So absolutely, we should find a way for the refugees to find safety, but how about they come find safety here in the United States? Whether it's those specific ones or some that we take others that are resettled, but we can't, I just think we're not gonna be taken seriously by these countries. It's so easy for us to say that you take on the refugees, because, I mean, this is not to vilify refugees, but it is an expense, and I'm willing to pay it on my taxpayer. I think we should, we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
Sahar, I also wanted to build on that as a Syrian American, because I was actually just in Syria this past June, and while I was there, the cost used to be $1 to 50 lira about 10 years ago. When I was there, it was $1 to 550 lira, and then it actually went to 600 lira. So I wondered if you could also speak on the implications of sanctions being used in the country, and sanctions actually impact. I also wondered if you could talk about the risk of safety in the camps where people are being held. Because I know somebody had spoken about the camps earlier and about how 20% of people stay there and how there is health care, but also the risk as far as violence goes in the camp, sexual violence especially, as far as safety from people stealing things within the camps. Along those lines of real issues that can be addressed.
I just wanted to, I think, a superstar. Legal fellow. Yay. I was actually going to say something else, just to follow up on what was stated, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to address your question. I was going to just say that I think the American people, I think in this moment, actually do see what's happening, I think, in northern Syria as outrageous. I think there is some mobilization, at least at the grassroots level, I think, where people might be willing to say, okay, well, maybe we can let in, say, 10,000, people from Syria who are being impacted by the current crisis. That actually might pass. Like, I think there people would be interested in maybe allowing that, because there is an outrage. Because of a lot of people in the Armenian and Kurdish communities saying that we feel abandoned, etc. So maybe we can have some kind of, again, narrow quota, again, to few, but at least that would be a gesture, of good faith, showing, hey, okay, Turkey needs to pull out, and we'll take in some refugees. And like I said earlier, even if Trump is not going to go back and put in place the Iran nuclear deal, which was of course a disaster to pull out of, I think. Even if that doesn't happen, and even if Assad does stay in place, which obviously has a lot of issues with it, that does not preclude the United States from putting pressure on its allies in the region. UAE, the Saudis, that's their neighborhood, and they need to do their part. And they're not doing their part. They're really not. And I think we can put pressure on them. We might not. I think it's foolish to not talk to Iran. It's foolish to cut off relations with us. We should talk. But I think even if he wants to hold on to his sort of hardline approach, that does not stop him from putting pressure on the allies in that region who are still in talks with us. So I think that's, just to piggyback on what you said, that's exactly right. That's the only way. You have to rebuild Syria and really start talking about the issue that is at the heart of this. But yeah, sorry, go ahead. But with respect to the medals, you can't say sanctions impacting.
Well, I just wanted to, building on what you were saying, about the need to rebuild Syria. And if you visit places like Raqqa, they're just completely obliterated by the war. And one of the other decisions that Trump made, actually, in addition to the withdrawal decision, was to zero out stabilization funding, which I think was a huge mistake. And that decision did not get nearly as much attention as the withdrawal decision. We had all these people who were up in arms about, oh, we're withdrawing U.S. troops, which I agree was a terrible idea. But the decision to zero out stabilization funding was also a terrible idea. And now, because we're withdrawing troops it's not clear yet, and I can't predict the future, but, how will stabilization, US funded stabilization, now that the money has been released again, one of the things we were doing was demining Raqqa, so removing the mines in Raqqa. How is that going to continue? How are basic stabilization programs going to continue if there's no US presence there? I mean, how will those, so I think this is an open question that I, personally worry about, because you cannot expect people to live in bombed out buildings for years and years. And you need a basic level of rebuilding. They need electricity, water, schools to operate, hospitals to operate. And if that doesn't happen, of course grievances will emerge. Of course people will be angry. They will try to find somebody to blame. And this is the perfect environment which, Islamists, extremists can exploit, because then they can come and say, well, see, the Americans aren't taking care of you, or the SDL aren't taking care of you, or the Kurds aren't taking care of you, or whatever, and then they will, find a way to recruit people to, join the extremist organizations. And so I think, obviously, we have to rebuild. I mean, obviously, the stabilization programs have to continue. And, Lauren's question about the bigger picture, I think it's important to mention that the coalition to defeat the Islamic State, right? We called ourselves a global coalition because there were 81 countries that were a member of the global coalition to defeat the Islamic State. That's more than 1/3 of all the countries in the world. So yes, we all should shoulder the burden. All of those 81 countries back on March 23rd, when they declared that the territorial caliphate was defeated in Syria, they all even patted themselves on the back and said, oh, we defeated the Islamic State. The people who actually did the fighting, who actually did the dying, the Syrian Democratic Forces, they lost 11,000 people. 11,000 members of the SDF were killed fighting the Islamic State. That's a huge number of casualties. It's a huge loss. I visited cemeteries across the region. It's tragic. And they fought together, Kurds and Arabs and Christians, they fought together to defeat the Islamic State, and they're buried together in cemeteries across the region. Young people in their 20s. And so all of those 81 countries that are part of the global coalition, they need to step up and they need to take responsibility for what is happening in the Northeast as part of this coalition. And that includes also stabilization funding, and to allow a basic level of a basic standard of living to be improved to the point that people can just have a dignified life and not expect that they should continue to live in these this war-torn region.
So I'm happy to answer that. Let me just comment also as one of the primary motivations for these countries, particularly the Western countries, to join the coalition against ISIS was because there were reports, and I think they were corroborated, that many of the attacks against Europe by Daesh had links to Daesh in northern Syria. So it's purely out of self-interest to try to, they were afraid that if Daesh grew and continued to exist, they were going to continue to do these attacks against these European capitals and at some point maybe cities in the United States. So again, this was not out of love for Syrians or humanitarian purposes. It was pure motif. And they said you want to then respond and say if you the current state, and we've seen this in the papers, people have made the argument, which is a more realist argument, is we should support, we should oppose what's happening in northern Syria because Daesh will come back and then go back to where we started vis-a-vis the West. Of course, Daesh and ISIS is also, as I said previously, they kill and harm and terrorize Muslims and natives way more than they do Westerns. But let's just understand why the Western countries were invested in the first place. With regard to your answer to the camps, it really just comes down to more resources. At this point, either they stay in the camps and then you have more resources that provide more security, that provide more social counseling and psychiatric assistance from the trauma that the refugees have experienced and much of its violence as a result of that. You address the different types of criminal activities. Or you let them out, but letting them out has different repercussions. Because if you let them out, don't give them work permits and don't assume that there's even jobs to begin with, and places to live, and means to eat, and you have other problems. But ultimately, the root cause is this gradual pullback of resources by Western countries. So the West is doing two things at the same time. It's closing its borders to refugees, and it's decreasing the amount of money that it's giving to either international humanitarian aid organizations or the neighboring countries to just provide the basic needs for these refugees. So I think we're all back to kind of the same thing, which is that we really need to get our government here to hold it more accountable. We need to be strategic and creative in how we can incentivize our country to do it. Ideally, it would be based on human rights principles and morals and commitment to refugees and all of the ideals that we're taught in school books. But if that's not the case, then we may have to turn to more realist incentives. We have time for one more question.
I am Brian Fred of the Office of Congressman Chris Smith. My question is just in relation to Europe, actually. So recently in Europe, there's been a lot of rise of populist groups. They've really been campaigning under the anti-refugee settlement. When I visited Germany, I saw that it's pretty scary to see how these parties are really rising up. My question to all three of you is, why do you think those parties have risen up? Is it because of refugees? Even though Germany did take in most refugees out of most European countries, really, as you point out, it's not that many compared to the other countries in Syria. And do you think if Turkey were to release the refugees into Europe, those groups will only continue to rise in popularity?
I'll take it too.
I think you're right that there is a link between the two, the rise of these right-wing parties in Europe and the refugees, although there have been right-wing parties in Germany actually for a long time. And when already in the early 90s, there were some of the really neo-Nazi parties that were carrying out attacks on immigrants already back then. So it's, I wouldn't say that there's a causality, but I think that there's, it's something that they certainly exploit, and when they look for scapegoats, blame them when people are refugees. Germany, as you know, took in 1 million refugees, and that's why I would also just fully agree with what my colleagues have said, is that if Germany took in 1 million refugees, we at the United States could at least take in 200,000, at least, I would think. So I fully agree that we should lift the Syrian refugee ban and do our fair share to take in refugees.
I'll put a pitch in for a conference I'm organizing in March on global Islamophobia and Arab populism. And I'm also teaching a class on that subject. Discussing these issues. I think the Syrian refugees are a visible scapegoat to a much bigger problem. There has been various structural seismic changes that are happening in demographics and global migration that is causing many people from the global south and the global east to migrate to Western Europe and to the United States and Canada. Some of it is refugees-based conflicts. There's probably going to be some climate change refugees and waves of them, some predictions of that. And others are related to neoliberal capitalist economic policies that have impoverished developing countries and enriched developed countries. And so the economics is causing at least the poorest in those developing countries to leave. So they're economic migrants just seeking basic economic needs and headed west to do that. So I think that's something that's happening. And then you also have the post-colonial migration, particularly, for example, the UK, where you've got people from Indian subcontinent. Right? So all that is to say that in Europe, the demographics is changing. And the EU has also created more migration across Europe, and many of you are familiar that the Western Europeans look down on Eastern Europeans. And so, interestingly, much of the Brexit, and there's different theories about Brexit, but many of the workers were coming from Eastern Europe. Many of the women were coming from Eastern Europe. They weren't all necessarily coming from global south and global east. And then the same thing's happening here. I think one of the reasons why white supremacy is rising here is because America's not going to be majority white by at least 2050 and possibly before that, which is a major identity shift to the extent that race continues to be the salient identity. And having a black president was a reminder of the first black president. So the refugees are easy scapegoats, but there's something much more deeper that's happening that is related to demographic shifts. And even if you just took that factor out, I think you would still have it. Maybe they're a catalyst, arguably speaking. But the data is not showing that, for example, you have a higher crime rate because of refugees, that you have all of these social cross-terrorism, that you have violence. It's just not, it's not supported. These claims are not supported by the facts.
Thank you so much. So I will say, so I'm Algerian American and I live in France. So, France has probably the biggest identity crisis right now in Europe. They actually have a special office for national identity. They are really having issues. And so everything that the professor said is absolutely 100% right. It's also very important to remember one thing. Syrian refugees are extremely educated. And it was alluded to earlier. So Germany was very shrewd. It was in their interest to bring Syrian refugees. They're doctors, they're engineers. These are not people who are coming and just living off of the system. They want to work. And I was in Lebanon this summer, and I was on a plane. I told my Meta, and when I was on a plane, the girl sitting next to me was a Syrian refugee leaving Syria. And she's a doctor, and she's going to Germany to reunite with her husband. Her husband works in the ministry there. So those are the stories that we don't hear in the media. And so Syrian refugees are highly educated, and they are actually a value add to Europe. And that's why Germany took it in partly why. And the second thing I'll say is that, I think that this is something that is really tragic. And I really hope that people will do their part to reframe a narrative that refugees are resilient, powerful people who are doing incredible things everywhere that they go. And that we want to be a country that does not vilify and frankly rewrite the truth. And so we have to really do our part, even if it's at the micro level of teaching our kids and teaching people we know that it's just not true that they're bringing problems and everything. It's not true. And it's actually shameful because we created a mess that they have to live with, and they're doing the best they can. So with that, I will end and thank our speakers one more time.